Okay, hi friends in crypto. I'm Amber Scott. This is Nikita the Compliance Chihuahua who has jumped in to say hello in honor of Doge Fest this month. And she has been with me all weekend as I go through the draft amendments to Canada's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing regulations. So for now, she's going to say goodbye because as adorable as she is, she's a Chihuahua and isn't necessarily adding a ton of insight as far as regulation goes. I'm going to start with some hefty disclaimers, so if you have seen any of my work before, you can essentially skip the next 30 seconds. I'm not a lawyer. Nothing I say should be interpreted as legal advice. I know an awful lot about how governments and government agencies work, but I don't officially represent any of them, and nothing that I say should be interpreted as an official government statement or position. And from there, let's talk a little bit about what's happening. Back in 2014, Bill C-31, which was an omnibus budget bill in Canada, passed. And this bill stated that dealing in virtual currency, which was not defined at the time, was going to be regulated as money service or MSB business. But this couldn't come into force until there were amendments to other legislations, including the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Counter-Terrorist Financing Act and its amended regulation, or its enacted regulations. This has happened. These were published on the 9th of June, and you can see a link there. We'll add a link down in the description of the video as well so that you have access to all of those things. But those were published this weekend. It is about 200 pages in total. Not all of them having to do with digital currency, but about 200 pages of changes to the Act and regulations. And so we've spent the weekend combing through those, and I'm here today with some highlights for you. Before we get started, in terms of the process and timelines, the draft was just published. There's a 90-day comment period. And so this is time for us to get it together, make comments to the Department of Finance. The Department of Finance then goes back to the Batcave, and they take those things, they synthesize them, they make updates, and they publish a final version. Once that final version is published, the current draft says that there will be a 12-month transition period to comply. What that means is, as far as today goes, don't panic. If you don't have a compliance program, you don't need to whip one together lickety-split. If you already have a compliance program, you don't need to worry about making updates to that right away. In fact, if you already have a compliance program that's working well for you, start to think about these changes and what they mean to you. But I wouldn't actually start making changes to the program itself until you have that final version. The reason I say that is because I really don't like rework. So I would rather get something done right the first time than to spend a lot of time and money doing something that isn't necessarily the right thing and may need to be done over anyway. And with that said, what are these amendments or proposed amendments actually saying? Well, first of all, they're saying that businesses that are dealing in virtual currency will be regulated as money service businesses. This means that these businesses will have to have a compliance program. This consists of nominating someone to be the compliance officer, so that's someone who will oversee the compliance program, to have written policies and procedures, a documented risk assessment, which is a specific document that talks about the risk that your business could be used to launder money or finance terrorism, training, so training for any staff members that interact with your transactions, that interact with your customers, and an effectiveness review, which is like an audit but for compliance. On the operational side, you'll need to collect customer information, so that KYC or know your customer information, as well as identify customers according to some very specific prescribed methods. You'll need to keep certain records, report certain types of transactions to FinTrack, and to register as a money service business. So we've got a link down here if you want to learn more about what the current obligations for money service businesses are. If you're a crypto person and you look at this right now, you're going to look at it and say, well, this isn't me. It has nothing to do with me. It doesn't yet. It will. It does tell you what MSBs are doing today, and what you'll need to do down the line is fairly similar to that. I'm going to jump into a couple of definitions because when it comes to compliance, I think that the details really matter. So one of the first definitions was for digital currency itself. They define that as something that is not a fiat currency, readily exchanged for funds, or for another digital currency that can be readily exchanged for funds. So I thought that was interesting, that there was a little jump there, as well as information that enables a person or entity to access digital currency referred to in paragraph A. Now, I think that has some potential implications that are pretty broad. and perhaps a little bit broader than the government intended. And so I really hope that this definition is something that we see people in the community commenting on, talking about the implications, refining that, and hopefully coming up with some suggestions as to how it can be made better. I found it really interesting that the proposed amendments also define what is not a virtual currency. So there's a lot of things that talk about funds, so electronic funds transfers or funds received by financial institutions, and they do go as far as to call out that for greater certainty, when they say funds, they don't mean virtual currency, which becomes important to the context of the whole act itself and its regulations. The other thing that I thought was fairly interesting was that there is a definition for fiat currency, and fiat currency itself comes up throughout this draft. The term that isn't defined that surprised me a little bit was dealing in virtual currency. So what exactly does that mean? It isn't defined, but from the context, I believe that what it refers to at this time is exchange activity, sending virtual currency or receiving virtual currency on behalf of another person or entity. I will go as far as to say that I'm crossing my fingers and hoping that that's what they meant and that it's not something broader than that. Although in this case, I think that we may benefit from a little bit more definition within the context of the regulations themselves. There are in that definition, although there isn't a definition, there are some pretty astute exclusions. And those included the transfer or receipt of virtual currency as compensation for the validation of a transaction that is recorded in a distributed ledger, or in exchange for the transfer or receipt of a nominal amount of virtual currency for the sole purpose of validating another transaction or the transfer of information. So those I thought were pretty good carve-outs. I don't think that they're fulsome in terms of what I would like to see as carve-outs and what I don't think they mean to capture. I would like to see carve-outs specifically for instance, tokens that are just used within the context of a game, because there are in a lot of circumstances secondary markets for those, but they're not particularly risky from a money laundering perspective. The other thing that I would like to see get an explicit carve-out is other than certain prescribed situations. For instance, dealers in precious metals and stones will have a requirement to collect certain information, identify customers, and file certain types of reports when they receive payment, for instance, for a gold bar using virtual currency. But outside of those situations, so if I'm buying a laptop or I'm buying a jacket, the intent is, as far as I can tell, not to capture retail businesses that are making those types of sales to the public. And so that's something that I'd like to see very explicitly captured and called out, because I imagine that there are a lot of merchants in the Canadian context that will have some trepidation about what this actually means. It goes on to define a virtual currency exchange transaction. And this is another place where I have a little bit of hesitation, so there's some pieces of this definition that don't surprise me at all. So when you talk about the movement from virtual currency for funds or vice versa, and remember funds again, we were talking about fiat currency, that makes sense to me. That's very much in line with the FATF's guidance in terms of on and off ramps. But what surprised me a little bit was that we also have the exchange of one virtual currency for another. And this is a place where I think it could be problematic for some existing business models. It's not clear to me how this fits with things that aren't businesses, things that are simply code that's running on the internet. But I digress. I think those are definitely some of the conversations that we need to have as a community and hopefully tighten up these definitions and make them better. When this happens, so when you have a virtual currency exchange, there's a virtual currency exchange transaction ticket that has to be kept. So this is just information about the transaction itself. And if the transaction has a value of $1,000 or more in Canadian dollars, there's a requirement to identify the customer. There's a requirement to collect certain information about the customer. There's also the concept of a large virtual currency transaction. So these are transactions that are valued at $10,000 or more within the same 24-hour period by or on behalf of the same person or entity. And here there's some additional information that's required, including a determination of whether the transaction is being conducted by that person on their own behalf. So is this a transaction that I'm doing for me as Amber, or is this a transaction that I'm doing because someone else has asked me to do the transaction and I'm doing a transaction on their behalf? For politically exposed persons, there will be a requirement at the $100,000 mark to determine if a person is politically exposed, either foreign or domestic, or the head of an international organization, or a family member or a close associate of any of those people. If they are, then the source of the virtual currency specifically, as well as the source of wealth for that person generally, will need to be established. One of the pieces that doesn't refer specifically to virtual currency, but I think has pretty far-reaching implications in our space, is that for the first time, foreign companies that are dealing with people in Canada but don't have a significant nexus to Canada. And so what I mean by that is there are no agents, there are no offices, there are no employees located in Canada, but they may be serving Canadian customers, will actually be covered by this legislation. If you'd like to join the conversation, we've got some tools for you. We have made a posting about our initial thoughts. We've set up a brief survey that we hope you'll answer in terms of how some of these definitions could be tightened up and made better. And that can be submitted without any personal information, so you don't have to tell us who you are if you're completing the survey. We know that some folks are probably a little bit gun-shy about submitting that type of feedback, and we wanted to have a forum that was good for you. We also have a community event coming up in Toronto. We'll be announcing more events across the country that we'll be at, essentially to help folks understand what's coming and to collect your comments. You can also get in touch with us through our contact form anytime. And finally, if you love doges like Nikita the Compliance Chihuahua and you want to go do something fun that maybe doesn't have anything to do with regulation, we highly recommend checking out DogeCon in Vancouver later this month. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Have a great day.